Hello, I am Dr. Lawrence Smith, Dean of the Donald and Barbara Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra Northwell. Thank you for tuning in to Well Said. In a culture of community, scholarship, and innovation, the Zucker School of Medicine is dedicated to transforming students into doctors who will improve healthcare, inspire change, and better the lives of the people they serve. It is why we are pleased to collaborate with WRHU Radio Hofstra University to bring you a program committed to sharing expert discussion and insight on health and wellness topics important to you. Join us today and each week for a recommended dose of Well Said with your host, Dr. Ira Nash.
Hello, I'm Dr. Ira Nash. Welcome to Well Said. Today we'll be discussing aging. We'll be talking about what happens to our health and well-being with age and what we can do to avoid or delay the disability that many associate with getting older. My guest is my colleague, Dr. Edith Burns. Dr. Burns is a professor of medicine in the Division of Geriatrics and Palliative Medicine at the Donald and Barbara Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra Northwell. She is also the Director of Research of the Division of Geriatrics and Palliative Medicine, and I'm delighted that she's joining us. Edith, welcome to Well Said.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let's start with a personal question, which is just how well have you been holding up through these extraordinary times that we've all been living through?
They are extraordinary times, that's for sure. I've been very, very busy. So I think most of us here on the East Coast have found that, especially when we're in the medical profession, that it's been a scary, exciting, stimulating, and rewarding time. So all those things, closer to colleagues and closer to our patients and families as a result.
You're an expert in the aging process and in the care of older adults. And it seems to me that that's kind of an increasingly important role as the population of older adults expands. Could you just give us a sense of how much larger that population is getting, both in absolute terms and relative to other age groups in our country?
I mean, I remember when I was doing my training, which is quite a while ago now, and we used to say, that about 10% of the United States population were comprised of adults 65 and older, that it was growing exponentially, and it is now today over 17%, and this is only a short 15 years later. We expect that it's going to double by 2050, so that over 20% of the population we expect will be 65 and older. Yeah, it's the adults 80 years and older, I think, are still the fastest growing segment of our population age-wise. So the number of older people in the country is now outstripping how many younger kids, how many babies are born.
And that has all kinds of implications for our culture, our economy, most of which we're not going to talk about today. But I am curious, so you said that the folks over 80 is the fastest growing segment of the population. How many people over 80 are there in the United States, roughly speaking?
I'm not sure how many over 80 there are. I know that there are about 52 million people over the age of 65 right now.
Obviously, not all older adults are alike, but can you give us a sense of what this population looks like in the aggregate, meaning how many are living independently in the community versus requiring institutional care, how many have medical problems, how many are healthy? Just give us a picture of what this older segment of our society looks like.
Surprisingly, about 93%, actually a little over that, of adults 65 and older live in the community, so they live at home. Only about 4.5% live in a skilled nursing facility. Maybe another 2% live in assisted living settings. One of the interesting things about the older adult population that we see is that there is an increase in what we call heterogeneity, so that there's much more variability in the spectrum of how healthy people are, how disabled they are, when you compare adults 65 and older to, say, adults between the ages of 20 and 30. So you see a much more homogeneous population when you're looking at young adults. So most people are healthy. And when you're looking at the older adult population, you do tend to see that a lot of folks live with chronic illness. They become more common as people get older. certain kinds of conditions like arthritis are pretty common as we get older. And that can certainly have an impact on how active and functional someone can be. Again, we see in a sense, a more complicated picture and more complicated spectrum of health and illness.
And I imagine those percentages that you quoted, while they may be true for the entire population of 65 and older, if you look at an even older group, like 80 and older, those percentages would be very different, right?
Yeah. I think, the older the age you focus on, the more you're going to see people who are more disabled. Maybe 20% of adults 80 and older live in a nursing home, but still the vast majority of the geriatric population overall lives in the community.
Tell us a little bit about the trends you see in this group over time, meaning how this group of older adults compares to a cohort of older adults had we looked at them 20 years ago. I mean, is it really true that 60 is the new 40 or 80 is the new 60?
In some ways, I think that's true. I think there are more people who are healthier when they get into older age groups than there used to be maybe 30 or 40 years ago. But we also see that because we're living longer, we see people living longer with more chronic illnesses. Mm-hmm. So, again, I think it reflects what we in healthcare see, that you see a pretty wide variability amongst the older adult age group, which is one of the things which makes it such an interesting area to work in, and can make it challenging, but also makes it a lot of fun.
You bring up this interesting distinction between living long and living well. I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Are we prolonging life past the point where people can still live well?
I don't think so. I think a lot of people live well with chronic conditions if they're able to manage them, if they have help from their family, if they practice healthy habits. So just because you have certain chronic conditions doesn't mean that you don't have good quality of life or aging well. Again, that's something that's a little bit different for a given different individuals. So what might be more difficult and be perceived as being a lower quality of life for one person may not be the case for somebody else.
Do you have a definition or a mental model of successful aging? What does that mean to you?
Successful aging, healthy aging. And this is something that you actually find in the literature, so a lot of scholars and investigators write about this. And, successful aging implies that somebody remains engaged socially, mentally, and I think is healthy or manages their health well. So those tend to be the three sort of domains I think that a lot of academics think of when they think or talk about successful aging.
And I imagine there's a lot of variability about that too, right? Because I can imagine that one person may feel disabled with the same burden of disease that another person feels doesn't inhibit their sense of well-being or their ability to enjoy friends and family and other things. So how much of this is kind of an individual measure of I feel okay versus some objective measure of the burden of disease?
I think, there's the individual personal layperson's approach to looking at this. There are specific definitions and criteria that can be used by a researcher or by a doctor. So I think it depends upon what the setting is and what the context is. Like you said, there may be one person who has arthritis and difficulty in the knees and they can't walk so easily, and so they can't go out hiking anymore, and that they perceive that as being a terrible blow to their quality of life, where someone else would say, well, I can still get out and walk and take a stroll with my family member, and that's good. So I think it's partly depends on the context in which you're looking at it.
Yeah. So you mentioned before the fact that as we age, as the population ages, there's a broader spread of how well folks are doing. How much of that depends on what choices people make earlier in their lives? Can we sort of make sure we're in that group that's doing well as opposed to that group that is doing less well?
That's also, you're asking all these really difficult questions.
I'll take that as a compliment.
Yeah, no, it is, and it's something I think about a lot. I think that first of all, it's never too late to start changing your lifestyle and your healthy habits. So somebody who's 80 years old, they can derive benefit if they start to walk every day where they've never done it before. But certainly if you have certain habits and routines being younger, it makes it easier to then maintain it into your later life. And I think you may have a few extra strategies under your experience that you can then apply, which may help you to maintain function more easily as you get older. It's sort of, I often think about something like, bone strength. And, we know now that for women who are especially at risk for developing thin bones as they get older, that your peak bone mass is really determined when you're in your teens. So doing things, to establish your peak bone density as, setting the bar as high as possible when you're younger. And again, physical activity, proper diet, all those things can contribute and help to diminish risks for then developing thin bones later on. So the higher you get to, then the longer you have to fall, essentially. And I think that's true for a lot of different parts of aging. So if you are, quote, able to follow a healthy diet, or if you have a good daily exercise routine, you're more likely to be able to then maintain that into later life. But that doesn't mean that if you've never done it before, you can't ever start to do it.
Thank you for making that distinction. But I do want to focus a little bit more on the choices we make younger in life. And then we'll get to activity as one ages. But what I'm hearing is you're a believer in the sort of build it up when you're young, because as it decays as you get older, you'll have more in reserve, so to speak. Is that a reasonable way to think about it?
Yes. And I think there's some evidence to support that. So, that people have been, for example, with physical activity, if they've been more physically active at a younger age, they have reduced risk of a lot of different kinds of chronic conditions that become more common as people get older. So I think you're fortunate enough to be able to establish those patterns and habits when you're younger. It's a good predictor of doing well later on.
Does that apply to cognitive issues as well? I know we're talking about physical activity and preserving physical strength and forestalling physical disability, but what about your mental acuity, and does being physically active help prevent or slow mental decline?
There's, I think, some pretty strong evidence that being physically active reduces the risk of developing memory issues as people get older, lower rates of people developing dementia, maintaining their ability to function day to day. So, and it also, it improves other kinds of things as well. Mental health tends to be better. So people sleep better, they have lower rates of anxiety, depression. There's some newer data suggesting that it's beneficial for post-traumatic stress disorder and things like that. It can definitely impact that realm of the brain and thinking.
And what about this sort of cognitive exercise? Does doing the crossword puzzle, is that going to help me as I get older to hang on to my mental faculties, or am I just kidding myself?
I love doing the crossword too, in pen, I must say.
Oh, wow. Okay, good for you.
I think When you look at the literature on dementia and prior sort of academic achievement, so people who have gone farther in school, less likely to develop issues with dementia, there's evidence to suggest that, even at a very young age, that people who had more content when they wrote, so if they had more ideas packed into the things they wrote about, they tended to do better into extreme old age in terms of keeping their brains working. So, I know there's been kind of a proliferation of all these websites where they have puzzles and games
right.
Encourage people to practice those things. And again, I think the data is less strong for somebody who's, once you're older, or if you've started to have issues. I think the benefit of doing some of those things is much more difficult to demonstrate. I think keeping your mind mentally active and engaged when you still have the knowledge and capability, I think, yes, is a good thing.
You mentioned, going back to the physical activity, that there's benefit of being active at any age. So could you speak a little bit more to that, about the benefit of physical activity as we get older, not so much as a preventative when you're young, but as we get older, what the impact of being active or even starting to be active may be?
I would step back a little bit and say that one of the things we've sort of noticed in geriatrics for many years is that people who are more active physically tend to be more functional in all areas of their life over time. So there's an association there. And that function, when you look at how well someone's able to just provide for their own basic daily needs and then to engage in more complicated and complex daily activities, overall they just do better long term. One of the things we've seen in the last couple of years is really a lot of studies demonstrating that for a lot of different chronic conditions, for example, for congestive heart failure, for diabetes, that people just, if they start to walk, it improves outcomes from chronic illnesses like that. So we see fewer episodes of people getting hospitalized if they start to walk a little bit more. And that's fewer hospitalizations for heart failure, for example. And then same for diabetes. And I don't know if I just got off topic and I didn't answer your question.
I was just wondering, well, how much of that is that the healthier people are able to walk as opposed to walking makes you healthier?
There was a really interesting new study that just came out this year in New England Journal of Medicine, and I believe the lead center was located here in New York, where they started individualized physical activity programs for older adults who were in the hospital with congestive heart failure. Mm-hmm. And that was associated with then subsequently lower rates of hospital readmission. So again, these were mainly people who weren't consciously out there doing a lot of physical activity beforehand. They definitely realized a benefit just from walking and from maybe doing some balance training and some strengthening. And strengthening could be something simple like using bands, for leg muscles. Strength exercise and aerobic things like walking are associated with improvement.
Is it understood how that works? It's not entirely clear to me why walking would help keep an elderly person who has heart disease out of the hospital.
Right. So, and I think, at a pathophysiologic level, so at a basic cell level, we may not be quite sure of all the mechanisms that come into play here, but certainly you could theorize that when someone becomes physically active from walking, it stimulates the circulation. You can train your heart muscle it's like exercising your heart. If you walk some and you walk to challenge yourself a little bit, in terms of feeling like you're going to get tired faster, and then stop and rest, and you'll find over time you can do a little bit more each time.
Right.
Maybe that improving circulation to the brain. So you get more oxygen up where those brain cells are, and people do better cognitively and we can make some hypotheses. Whether those are actually true and what the finer mechanisms are, I don't think we know exactly yet.
In addition to recommending then to older adults that they try to either maintain if they've been active or even initiate some program of regular physical activity, what else is part of your recipe for older adults who come to you and say, hey, I'm getting on in years and I want to maintain my vitality and independence as long as I can? What should I do?
I counsel people on physical activity, the importance of setting short-term goals, intermediate goals, long-term goals. So thinking overall, what are the benefits that you could derive from this, but then how are you going to get there? The other thing I like to encourage people to do is, to maintain social ties, which obviously can be more difficult in this day and age with COVID and some of the social restrictions that we're facing. I think knowing your own conditions, managing your own medical issues as optimally as possible, knowing your medications and what those are, I think those are important. Looking through, taking advantage of the resources you have to have time with family. Sometimes I think in America we have this sort of streak of we have to be independent and be by ourselves and take care of ourselves, and that doesn't have to be. So you can rely on family, and it can be very rewarding and help develop a deeper relationship with family members by allowing them to help come in and support you in continuing to maintain activity. Volunteering, for folks who are retired, spend time there are a lot of different things that people can get involved in and that can be done remotely nowadays. So, teaching, mentoring adults in different settings, people who enjoy reading. Speaks back to your question about doing crosswords and things. I think doing things that keep the mind active as well as the body active, those are all important things to do.
Yeah, so engaging the mind, engaging the body. But I'm also struck by how you came back several times to the importance of maintaining social connections as a pathway to averting disability. Could you speak about that a little bit further?
Yeah, I think maintaining some of those social ties, it helps create a network that becomes intertwined and people support each other. In this day and age when it's harder and harder sometimes to find and access resources, that can be a very important way to help create a safety net.
Is it that these ties can offer assistance if you become disabled, or is it that the ties help maintain your actual well-being?
I think it's both, definitely both. So, we know that a lot of older adults, so many are living in the community because nowadays they rely on help and care from family, from friends. So, caregivers is sort of a parallel population to the geriatric population. Sometimes the caregivers or family care partners are themselves old, like spouses. And so it's a give and a take. It's not a one-way street.
We were talking earlier about people's perceptions about the elderly. I wonder if in your work you've come across some common misconceptions that you might want to dispel about the elderly as a group or what it means to get older.
I think a lot of people don't realize, they forget how much experience people acquire as they get older and all the experiences they've had. And, the longer you live, the more different, unique, and unusual things most people can tell you about and have to offer. I think being respectful of older adults is something that I think sometimes people struggle with. And I know my patients sometimes comment to me as they sort of feel like they're being treated like they are not capable. It's amazing what you can hear when you just stop and listen.
That's a great bit of advice. Are there any resources you'd like to share where folks can go either to get some information that's relevant to their own aging process or the care of elderly members of their family?
The internet now is full of resources and some very reliable and valid ones, just going to the CDC, National Institutes on Aging. So they all have lots of links to reliable resources. They have programs that are evidence-based programs for nutrition, for exercise, suggestions and links to resources back in people's individual communities. Local departments on aging are a great place to look. Your local health system, that we have. So within Northwell is a huge system, has a lot of resources. We have a lot of caregiver centers, centers for older adults, programs. I think senior centers throughout the area are a good place. Local YMCAs are opening up again. A lot of these national organizations have resources specifically for older adults and for families and for family caregivers.
Thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you for having me, Ira.
My guest has been Dr. Edith Burns. Dr. Burns is a professor of medicine in the Division of Geriatrics and Palliative Medicine at the Donald and Barbara Zucker School of Medicine, and she is also the Director of Research of the Division of Geriatrics and Palliative Medicine, and it's been my pleasure to have her with us today. For more information about this program and to find past episodes, please visit sites.hofstra.edu/wellsaid. You can also subscribe to our free podcast available on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Our listeners are welcome to send comments, suggestions, and questions to wellsaid@hofstra.edu. Until next time, I'm Dr. Ira Nash, and that's Well Said.